The Persian Gulf at noon is not a place that hides things well. The water is shallow, in places shallow enough that the keel clearance of a guided missile destroyer transiting at operational speed is measured in single-digit meters. And the surface in the midday heat becomes a mirror that magnifies and distorts everything above it. The sky turns white at the edges. The air shimmers. The horizon dissolves into a thermal layer where the boundary between sea and atmosphere becomes a negotiation rather than a line. There is nowhere in the Persian Gulf that offers concealment the way the open ocean does. No depth to disappear into. No weather system to use as cover. Everything is visible, if you know where to look and what you are looking for. The U.S. Navy Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer had been operating in the northern Gulf at 1:47 p.m., conducting a freedom of navigation transit through waters that Iran had, 11 days after the February 28 strikes, formally declared a contested maritime zone. The declaration carried no legal force under international law. It carried considerable practical weight, because the Revolutionary Guard Corps naval component had spent the preceding decade building an asymmetric doctrine specifically designed to exploit the physical geography of the Gulf, its shallowness, its constricted transit lanes, its proximity to Iranian coastal infrastructure, and had demonstrated in exercises and skirmishes both the intent and the capability to impose cost on any naval force that chose to challenge the declaration with a hull rather than a diplomatic note. The destroyer's crew had been at a heightened readiness posture since departing Bahrain 31 hours earlier. The threat brief had been specific: IRGC fast attack craft operating in coordinated swarm tactics, employing standoff anti-ship missiles from multiple bearing sectors to complicate the ship's defensive geometry. Underwater systems, semi-autonomous mine-like devices, and remotely piloted submersible platforms that could approach from below the ship's radar horizon. And the layered use of electronic harassment to degrade sensor performance and generate false track data intended to exhaust the combat system's discrimination capacity before the kinetic phase of an engagement began. The crew had read the brief. They had drilled the scenarios. They had set the watch rotations and verified the weapon systems and confirmed the rules of engagement and done everything that professional military preparation calls for. At 1:47 p.m., the Combat Information Center contained 17 sailors who were alert, trained, and ready, operating in an environment that was making all of that preparation feel like it might not be enough. At 1:47 p.m., the first anomaly registered. Not a radar contact. A sonar contact. The hull-mounted sonar system, operating in its active mode, had returned an echo from a bearing of approximately 340 degrees at a range of 2,400 yards. A return consistent with a submerged contact, not large enough to be a conventional submarine, not presenting the acoustic signature of a bottom feature or a biologic scatter. The sonar operator classified it as an unidentified submerged object, moving bearing drift, indicating a closing course. The tactical action officer was informed at 1:47:31 a.m. He designated the contact as a possible threat and tasked the ship to begin a classification hold, maintaining track while the sonar team worked to gather enough data to characterize the contact's identity and intent. The classification hold lasted 41 seconds before a second anomaly appeared, this one on the electronic warfare system, which detected a burst transmission in a frequency band associated with IRGC Naval Coordination Communications. The burst lasted 0.8 seconds, too short to provide content, long enough to confirm that someone nearby had used a military communication protocol. At 1:48 p.m., 12 surface contacts appeared on the ship's radar simultaneously. Not gradually, not sequentially, simultaneously, as though they had been waiting below the radar horizon, maintaining emission silence, and had risen or accelerated into detection range on a single, coordinated command signal. 12 contacts, bearing from 280 through 045 degrees, a distribution that placed them on 3 sides of the ship, across a front, spanning the full arc of the Gulf's northern channel. The contacts were moving fast. The radar's Doppler processing returned speed estimates between 38 and 44 knots, consistent with IRGC PACAP-class fast attack craft. Vessels built around a semi-planing hull that sacrificed everything: range, seakeeping, crew comfort, for the ability to close the distance between launch point and target faster than a defending warship's weapons engagement cycle could reliably respond. 12 fast attack craft on 3 bearing sectors. 1 submerged contact bearing down from the north. The electronic warfare suite was already registering radar emissions from the surface contacts, fire control sensors, targeting systems, the electronic precursors of a weapons engagement that had not yet been initiated, but was being prepared. The tactical action officer made the weapons free call at 1:48:18 p.m. The ship's 5-inch gun mount trained to the nearest contact cluster. 4 fast attack craft bearing 295 degrees at 6.8 nautical miles, and began cyclic engagement. The gun's report was a sound that had no equivalent in the civilian world. A flat, hard percussion that repeated at a rate fast enough to be almost mechanical. Each round a projectile traveling at velocities that compressed the distance to target into units of seconds rather than minutes. The first fast attack craft was rendered inoperable at 6.1 nautical miles. A direct hit that produced a secondary detonation visible to the bridge team as a low, orange-white flash at the waterline. A flash that persisted for approximately 3 seconds before the craft's hull began to settle. The second craft in the same cluster altered course immediately, not retreating, but executing a high-speed turn that placed it on a bearing that would bring it to within effective standoff missile range of the destroyer's hull in under 4 minutes. The gun traversed. The second engagement required 3 rounds to achieve a disabling hit at 5.4 nautical miles. In the Combat Information Center, the tactical action officer was already working the second bearing sector. The contact's bearing from 010 degrees, 3 fast attack craft at 8.1 nautical miles, had accelerated to maximum speed after the gun's engagement on the western sector contacts, their track behavior indicating they had received a command to commit. They were running the timing. The doctrine was clear enough. Force the ship to divide its fire between multiple approach sectors simultaneously, accept losses in the individual craft, and generate a window in which at least one platform could close to effective launch range for its anti-ship missiles. The SM-2 engagement sequence was authorized at 1:49 p.m. against the northern sector contacts, which were the fastest closing and most geometrically threatening. 2 standard missiles left the VLS forward magazine in rapid succession, their rocket motors lighting the midday sky with a brightness that was nearly invisible against the white Gulf haze. Not the dramatic flame plumes of a night launch, but a shimmer of superheated air and a rising white smoke column that was the only visible evidence of weapons traveling beyond visual range toward targets that the ship's combat system was tracking. But no human eye could see at this distance. The first SM-2 achieved a direct hit on a northern sector fast attack craft at 7.3 nautical miles. Total loss of asset. The second SM-2 guided on the second northern contact, which had begun an evasive maneuver at what appeared to be the moment of the first impact. The surviving craft's crew, having observed the detonation and initiated a high-speed course change that placed them on a crossing track relative to the missile's predicted intercept point. The SM-2's seeker updated. The intercept geometry changed. The round achieved a proximity detonation rather than a direct hit, close enough to produce significant fragmentation damage to the craft's propulsion system, reducing it to a slow, smoking vessel no longer capable of closing the distance, but not a clean kill. The third northern contact continued its approach, undeterred, at a speed that would bring it to missile launch range in approximately 90 seconds. At 1:50 p.m., the sonar system updated its classification of the submerged contact. The team had now accumulated enough data to characterize the contact's acoustic signature and maneuvering behavior. Their assessment, delivered to the tactical action officer in the flat, careful language of a sonar team that understands the weight of their words, was that the contact was consistent with an IRGC, remotely operated underwater vehicle, an unmanned submersible platform carrying a warhead designed to maneuver beneath a surface vessel and detonate against the hull below the waterline, in the zone where the ship's damage control architecture was most vulnerable and where a single successful attack could compromise watertight integrity in ways that a shape charge impact on the superstructure could not replicate. The ship had no dedicated underwater engagement system that could respond in the time frame available. The contact was at 1,800 yards and closing. The options were acoustic countermeasures, devices that could generate false target signatures to divert the underwater vehicle's terminal guidance, and a course change that might increase the distance between the ship's hull and the contact's closing vector. Neither option was a certain solution. Both were executed simultaneously at 1:50 and 12 seconds p.m. The course change ordered by the commanding officer was a hard turn to starboard, a maneuver that reduced the ship's speed briefly, but altered the geometry between the hull and the submerged contact's approach bearing. The acoustic countermeasures deployed from the ship's decoy launchers entered the water and began generating the false signatures that the system's engineers had designed to confuse the terminal guidance of exactly this class of threat. In the CIC, no one spoke about the underwater contact for 17 seconds. The sonar team tracked it. The course change executed. The countermeasures worked. The sonar trace showed the underwater vehicle altering course at approximately 1,400 yards, moving away from the ship's new track, apparently acquiring the acoustic countermeasure as its target. The update registered on the display as a bearing change, a track divergence, a curve of green light on the scope. That meant the vehicle was no longer heading for the hull. The relief in the sonar space was a physical thing, not expressed, not announced, but present. But the course change that had defeated the underwater attack had also altered the ship's orientation relative to the surface threat sectors. The starboard turn had closed the angle to the eastern sector fast attack craft, 2 contacts at 4.2 nautical miles that had been approaching from a bearing where the ship's gun coverage was most favorable, and which were now at an angle where the gun's maximum elevation created a dead zone in the engagement geometry. The tactical action officer recognized the problem at 1:51 p.m. and authorized a second SM-2 launch against the closest eastern contact. The missile guided cleanly. The contact was eliminated at 3.8 nautical miles. The second eastern contact launched its anti-ship missile at 1:51:44 p.m. The missile had a flight time of approximately 28 seconds to the ship's estimated position. The combat system detected the launch immediately. The infrared signature of the missile's rocket motor was unambiguous. The track resolved within 1 second of launch. The fire control solution computed within 2. The ESSM engaged at 1:51:49 p.m. The intercept occurred at 1:52:09 p.m., at approximately 2.1 nautical miles from the ship's hull. The incoming missile was destroyed. The debris pattern produced a small, hot return on the radar that dispersed over the following 8 seconds, 28 seconds from detection to intercept. In those 28 seconds, every sailor in the Combat Information Center had known exactly what was happening and had been unable to meaningfully influence the outcome. The system had handled it. But the knowledge that a weapon had been in the air, bearing on the ship, and that human action had been essentially spectatorial in the engagement, was a specific kind of information that settled differently than the radar track data or the weapons expenditure reports. It settled in the body, in the hands that were no longer entirely steady on the console surfaces. The third northern contact was neutralized by the 5-inch gun at 1:52:30 p.m. at a range of 2.9 nautical miles. The craft had closed to that range while the ESSM engagement was consuming the combat system's attention, not through any sophisticated tactic, but through the brute arithmetic of speed and time and the limits of what a single ship's crew could track and engage simultaneously, 2.9 nautical miles. Less than 3 minutes from a standoff missile launch position had the gun not reached it. The western sector contacts, the ones that had initiated the engagement, of which 2 remained functional after the gun's initial fire, had been maneuvering throughout the preceding 3 minutes. They had not retreated. They had circled, maintaining a range band that kept them outside the most effective gun engagement zone, while they waited for a window created by the ship's defensive attention being directed elsewhere. At 1:53 p.m., with the eastern contact neutralized and the northern threat resolved, both western contacts accelerated simultaneously toward the ship on converging tracks. The gun traversed to the nearest contact, fired, disabled at 4.1 nautical miles. The final contact, the last fast attack craft of the 12 that had appeared simultaneously on the radar at 1:48 p.m., closed to 3.3 nautical miles before the gun round that eliminated it was fired. 3.3 nautical miles in the shallow, reflective, noon water of the Persian Gulf, a distance short enough that the crew on the bridge could see the craft with the naked eye. Not clearly, not in detail, but a shape, a dark spot against the white shimmer of the Gulf's surface. A vessel that had launched at speed with intent to close on a warship and had been reduced to a debris field by a weapon traveling faster than its crew had time to fully process. At 1:54 p.m., the Combat Information Center radar picture showed 0 fast attack contacts. The sonar display showed the underwater vehicle still tracking the acoustic countermeasure, now at 2,100 yards on a divergent bearing, no longer a threat. The engagement had lasted 6 minutes and 47 seconds. The 5-inch gun barrel was at its thermal operating limit. The gun's cooling system had been running continuously through the entire engagement cycle, and the automatic temperature monitoring had registered a warning indicator at 1:53:40 p.m., 60 seconds earlier, and the gun's fire rate would have been automatically reduced to prevent barrel damage. The margin had been 60 seconds. The VLS magazine had expended 3 SM-2 rounds and 2 ESSM rounds. The remaining interceptor count was sufficient for continued operations, but the specific inventory reduction in the SM-2 allocation reflected the reality that the ship had just consumed a meaningful portion of its long-range surface engagement capacity against a threat that had approached in a geometry designed to force exactly that consumption. The electronic warfare suite had recorded the full engagement's signal environment. The post-engagement analysis would later identify a coordinated command signal that had activated all 12 fast attack contacts simultaneously, a central coordination architecture that suggested the engagement had been controlled from a shore-based or airborne command node, rather than executed autonomously by individual craft commanders. Someone had been watching the radar picture, had assessed the ship's position and approach geometry, and had issued the commitment order. At the moment, the tactical geometry appeared most favorable. Someone had planned this. The commanding officer stood at the center console and reviewed the engagement data. He noted the gun barrel thermal warning. He noted the underwater vehicle contact, still tracked by sonar, now at 3,400 yards on a continuing divergent bearing. He noted the anti-ship missile launch and intercept at 2.1 nautical miles. He looked at the position plot. The course change executed to defeat the underwater approach had moved the ship 1.8 nautical miles off its planned transit track. The freedom of navigation transit had been interrupted by a defensive engagement that had demanded everything the crew and the ship's systems possessed for 6 minutes and 47 seconds. The transit would continue. That was the commanding officer's decision, and the only available decision consistent with the mission. To divert, to retreat, to alter the transit route in response to the engagement would be to hand the adversary an outcome that 12 fast attack craft and an underwater vehicle had failed to achieve through direct action. The transit would continue. The ship would proceed on its planned track, with a gun barrel that needed 40 minutes to cool, with a reduced interceptor inventory, with a crew that had just fought and won an engagement that had brought a shaped charge warhead to within 2.1 nautical miles of the hull, and an underwater vehicle to within 1,400 yards of the keel. The transmission to 5th Fleet at 1:58 p.m. was terse and complete. 12 fast attack contacts engaged and eliminated. 1 underwater vehicle diverted with countermeasures. 1 anti-ship missile launched and intercepted. No hull damage. No personnel casualties. Gun barrel temperature nominal after cooling cycle. Ship continuing assigned transit. The deck of the destroyer reflected the noon sun at a flat angle that made the metal surface almost too bright to look at directly. Below that surface, in the Combat Information Center, the sailors who had fought the engagement began the post-engagement procedures. And stopre, the logs, the reports, the system checks, the weapons inventory update that would tell 5th Fleet what remained in the magazine and what needed to be restocked before the ship could credibly hold this patrol area against a second engagement of equivalent scale. The Persian Gulf did not change. The heat was the same. The shallow water was the same. The white sky at the horizon was the same. 12 craft that had approached this ship with intent were distributed across the Gulf floor in various states of structural compromise. But the Gulf itself registered none of this. The water covered everything with the same indifference it had shown to every engagement fought in these waters across 4 decades of contested maritime history. The ship moved through it. That was the sum of the outcome. The ship moved through the water that had tried, through 12 fast attack hulls and 1 submersible platform and 1 anti-ship missile, to stop it. And it could not be stopped. Not today. Not with this crew in this system, and this 6 minutes and 47 seconds that everyone aboard would carry as a specific, embodied memory for the rest of their lives. The shallow water of the Persian Gulf holds nothing below its surface except the depth of the decision to be present in it. And the decision had been made. Forward. Through.